Okay, so we're gonna study right now because I've been like bed rotting, and so I need to study. So we're gonna talk about the membrane potential, which is important in studying neuroscience because when we're studying about the neuroscience, it's important to study about the action potential, which is the electrical signal that is basically transferred and conveyed throughout the neurons. And so, to talk about action potential, we need to have a better understanding of ion channels. So, first of all, ion channels are usually selective, and so, and there are a lot of type of ion channels that we're going to talk about. So, there are four general types of ion channels. So, first of all, is the phosphorylation gated ion channels, which means that the whether it's phosphorylated or dephosphorylated, the ion channels will be open or closed. And then there's also the voltage gated ion channels, which means that the difference in the change of the membrane potential will lead to the conformational change, which leads to the opening or closing of the respective ion channels. And then there's the ligand gated ion channels, which means that the binding of certain ligands into the ion channel itself leads to conformational change that open or closes the ion channels. And lastly would be the pressure or like stretch gated ion channels, which when pressure or stress is applied, it kind of like stretch the ion channel open via the cytoskeleton that is bonded to the ion channels. So one of the explanation of how a voltage gated sodium channel open is that when at the resting state, but the cell is really polarized, right? It's very hyperpolarized, which means that inside of the cell the membrane potential is like really negative, but outside of the cell is relatively more positive. So inside of the cell at the resting state is like minus 80 to like minus 100 millivolt, which is very very negative, right? And so what happened is that these on these channels, the ion no no not the ion, the positively charged amino acid residues that are on the ion channels, on the inside of the ion channels, are located more towards like at the lower part of the ion channels that is in contact with the more of the negative charge that is on the inside of the cells because of the electrostatic interaction, right? Minus and plus attract each other. And so but then during depolarization, what happens is that inside of the cells get more and more positive, and so it kind of like repel the positively charged amino acid residues towards the upper part of the ion channel, and this leads to the opening of the sodium channel, which leads to more incoming or influx of the sodium ions, which leads to more depolarization and eventually leads to the formation of action potential. So that's kind of like the basic way of how action potential is generated and how these voltage gated sodium ion channels are opened. And so with regards to the sodium and potassium ion channels, they're both are cation channels, right? But they have their own respective selectivity. So sodium channels are selective for sodium, and potassium channels are selective for potassium. And so the way these the selectivity works is that sodium ions, although they're smaller in size, their charge is more dense because it's kind of like you're spreading that 1 plus charge in a smaller surface area, and so the charge density is higher in sodium, and so they're more solvated by the water, and so they have a larger solvation cell. So in total, like the solvated sodium ion is larger compared to the solvated potassium ion, because the potassium ion is larger, and also the charge density is not as dense, it's not as concentrated, and so the solvation is weaker in the potassium, and so it has a smaller solvation shell, which means smaller size. And so that means that the larger size solvated sodium ion cannot pass through the potassium ion channel. But then what about the potassium ion, solvated potassium ion? If it's small enough, can it pass through sodium channels? The answer is no, because during the during the incoming or influx of the sodium ion through the sodium ion channel, what happened is that some of the solvation cells, water, the water that solvates the sodium channels, they get desolvated. So it's kind of like taking away those water molecules, and then in the middle of it is like the carboxylate group of one of the amino acids residues stabilizes that sodium ion along with water. So it's kind of carboxylate, sodium ion, and then there's water, and the oxygen is kind of coordinating towards the not potassium, sodium ion, and then that water is also having a hydrogen bond with one of the carbonyl oxygen of the amino acid, and this transient stabilization can only occur for sodium and water because that cleft only fits that sodium and water and not potassium and water. Okay, so that's how that sodium ion channel can have that specific selectivity towards sodium ion and not for potassium. So that is the way ion channel works. And ion channels, the ligand gated ion channels, depending on the depolarization or polarization of the membrane potential, will lead to its opening or closing, right? So it always open or closes. There's nothing in between. So you need to remember that. And yeah, and then with regards to ion channel, you can think of ion channel as being like the resistor. Resistor, would it be correct to think of it as, but I don't know. But anyway, so there are two types of ion channels. There's the ohmic channel, which means it obeys the ohmic law, like voltage equals to current times resistance, right? And then there's also the what we call a refractory, rectifying channel. So rectifying channel means that it favors the current, a specific direction of the current itself. So it's not like a linear relationship. It's more like a rectifying relationship. Anyway, I don't really understand how it works, but anyway, it doesn't matter. So the channel proteins itself, so the hydrophobic amino acid residues that makes up the channel proteins, they're located on like the outer surface of the channel protein itself because they are in direct contact with the lipid bilayer, right? And then the more hydrophilic ones are located on the inside because the inside is hollow. Remember, channel proteins are essentially pores, like inside that is embedded on the membrane of the cell, right? And so the pores is also in contact with water, and so the more hydrophilic amino acid residues are located on the interior of the channel itself. So I need to know that. And then there's this thing called the ion pump. So there's a difference between channels and pumps. So channels are they often facilitate passive diffusion, which means the movement of certain molecules or substances or ions down their electrochemical gradient, while ion pumps, they usually facilitate active transport, in which using energy like ATP hydrolysis, they facilitate the movement of ions or substances against their electrochemical gradient. So you need to know about that. And then movement of ions move through diffusion by the facilitation of these either channels or pumps. And so without channels or pumps, there will be no ion movement across the semi-permeable, across the lipid bilayer, because this lipid bilayer is very hydrophobic, and so these polar ions, they cannot, charged molecules, they cannot pass through hydrophobic materials. So yeah, and then with regards to the movement of ions, so electric current influences ion movement, of course, that makes sense. And so if you have, let's say in here, I don't need to know that. I already know about that. And so for example, there's a cell, and then inside the cell is but the membrane potential is very negative, like minus 70 or minus 80 millivolt. And then you have potassium ion channel and sodium ion channel, right? Inside, you need to remember that inside of the cells, there's always a relatively low concentration of the sodium ion, and outside of the cells, there's always relatively high sodium ion concentration. And this is the exact opposite for potassium ion concentration. So potassium ion concentration inside of the cell is usually high, but outside of the cell is usually low. So if you think about it in terms of the concentration gradient, potassium ion concentration gradient favors its efflux, right? Because there's already too much inside of the cell, so it wants to move towards outside where there's less potassium ion concentration. And this is the opposite for sodium ion. Its concentration gradient favors its influx towards inside of the cell because there's less amount of sodium ion inside of the cell. And so it has the opposite concentration gradient for potassium and sodium ion. But then what you need to also take into account is not only is concentration gradient, but also its electrical gradient. So what it means is that although inside of the cell there's a lot of potassium ion concentration, and it based on the concentration gradient, it favors its efflux because inside of the cell membrane potential is already very negative, like minus 80, minus 70. It prevents these potassium ions from getting out of the cell. So it's kind of like holding in these potassium ions to be still stay inside of the cell and prevents its efflux. So this is what we call an electrochemical gradient, not only taking into account the chemical gradient but also its electrical gradient. So under this condition, when it's still minus 70 millivolt, the potassium ion concentration or chemical gradient favors it to be effluxed out, like getting out of the cell, but then its electric gradient makes it stay inside. But for sodium, if the channels is open, then both electrical and chemical gradient favors the sodium ions to be going inside of the cell. So that's the thing. So you just need to remember that you need to take into account not only the chemical gradient but also the electrical gradient. And then there's this called the Nernst potential. Nernst potential, or the equilibrium potential, is basically is a state in which both the electrical chemical gradient have equal and opposite values. So they're kind of like exerting equal and opposite forces, in which there is no net I would say net movement, which I mean there's still some movement, there's no net change, I guess. I would say maybe net movement. There's no net movement of the ions across the semi-permeable membrane because the electrical and chemical gradients are the exact opposite, and there's no net movement, right? So no net movement of the ions when separated by a phospholipid membrane, and equilibrium is reached, right, with the K plus channels. So membrane potential. Just remember that membrane potential is kind of like voltage in between across the neuronal membrane. So voltage across the neuronal membrane that separates the inside of the cell and outside of the cell. So that's what membrane potential really is. And then 4 important points with regards to equilibrium potential. First is the large changes in the voltage, the membrane voltage, membrane potential. So any changes in the membrane potential or the voltage across the membrane, the lipid bilayer, has a potential to change the equilibrium or the direction of the ion movements. So, for example, if the inside of the cell gets depolarized, these can actually lead to the opening of the sodium channels, which leads to the influx of the sodium, which is to more depolarization, which changes the equilibrium potential of these things, right? So the large changes in the membrane potential, the net difference in electrical charge, rate movement of ions across membrane, and concentration difference. Yeah, so concentration difference, rate movement, and then large change in the membrane potential, and then net difference in electrical charge. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So so the membrane resting potential is usually determined not only by a sodium potassium ATPase but also by the potassium channels, because the potassium channels really lead to the efflux of potassium. If I'm a second, yeah. Kendrick, why is there Kendrick? Kendrick is here. I don't see Kendrick. Where is Kendrick? I don't see. Maybe he already left. Sorry, I didn't see you, Kendrick. Yes. So the equilibrium potential is calculate the exact value of equilibrium potential for the Nernst equation. Calculates the exact value of the equilibrium potential. Remember, equilibrium potential is where there's no net movement of the ions across the lipid bilayer. Yeah, because of the equal and opposite forces of the electrical and chemical gradient. So it takes into consideration charge of the ion, the temperature, and the ratio of external and the chemical gradient. So it takes into charge in the chemical, the concentrations of inside and outside, charge, temperature, and the membrane potential. I'm hungry. Actually, I'm not hungry. I just want a snack. But I feel like I should stop eating snack because I'm so fat. So I just need to remember that the distribution of ions across the membrane. So things that affect the Nernst potential or the, what do you call that? The equilibrium potential is the concentration of the ions inside and outside of the cell, and then the membrane potential itself, and then also the temperature and the the rate of the movement of the ions. Charge of the ions, and rate of the movement of the ions. That difference in electric charge, large changes in. So there's always the chemical part, the electrical part, and temperature. So remember the charge of the ions itself, the temperature, and the difference in concentration of the ions inside of this and outside of the cells. And remember that calcium is also concentration more on the outside of the cell. So if you get into if the membrane potential gets closer into the equilibrium potential, and if it passes the equilibrium potential, there's a reversal potential, which means that the flow of the ions will be reversed. So for example, if the membrane potential, let's say, gets into minus 100 millivolt, and the reversal potential or the equilibrium potential for potassium is minus 80. So then instead of efflux of the potassium will come inside of the cell. So it's something like that. 아이고야. Inductors and resistors. 힘내, 고마워. I'm sleepy. I have a meeting with my professor tomorrow. I have a meeting with 2 professors tomorrow. Because I have to discuss some things. Yeah. I'm so tired, bro. So neural membranes transmit more than 10 ions. Membrane determine potential. I mean, this is easy as shit. Okay. So rest membrane potential is close to the equilibrium potential for potassium. And this is because it is mostly permeable to potassium. So remember, the membrane is mostly permeable to potassium, so the membrane potential is closer to the equilibrium potential of potassium. Yeah, so if basically if there's an increase in the amount of potassium in the extracellular area, extracellular space, there will be an influx of potassium inside, which leads to the depolarization. Uh, okay, that's easy. So I have like 12 chapters. Wait, no. No, 11 chapters. I'm on chapter 4 now. So I need to finish at least until chapter 10 or 8 at least, maybe 8. I'll do 8 today, and then tomorrow I'll finish the rest, and then I'll just cram everything together in my brain by tomorrow. I mean, this is technically already tomorrow. So tomorrow is today. So I have to finish everything by today because my exam is tomorrow at... When is my exam tomorrow? I don't remember. Wait, I have to go to freaking Songdo. That stupid ass professor. I hate him. I hate this one professor. He's frustrating me. Like, who has classes during the freaking midterm period? Should freaking cancel classes. I mean, this action potential is easy. I should... Okay. Sorry, I'm cursing a lot. Anyway. Yeah. Anyway, so basically we're gonna talk about the... Now we're gonna talk about the action potential. So action potential is quite easy to understand. Basically, it always involves depolarization of the membrane potential, which and then after a certain threshold, it will lead to basically opening of the sodium channel, which is the constant influx of the sodium inside of the cell, which is to further depolarization and leads to what we call an overshoot, in which the membrane potential goes above the threshold to generate the action potential. And then as the action potential as the membrane depolarizes, eventually the sodium ion channel closes, and at the same time the potassium ion channels are starting to open, and then because of the increase of the positive charge inside of the cell, now potassium ions is being pumped out out of the cell, because now the chemical and electrical gradients favor it to be pumped out, right? And then eventually potassium pumping out leads to the leads to the repolarization of the membrane potential, and also not only repolarization but also hyperpolarization, because the conductance of the ion channels are still open. This means that the potassium ion channels are kept open, which is the continuous efflux of the potassium ions, which leads to the hyperpolarization, which is the undershoot basically, where the membrane potential gets more depolarized, gets more polarized than its resting state, and eventually the potassium ion channels closes, which leads to the the membrane potential going back to its resting state or steady state, right? So that's basically the whole story of action potential and depolarization and hyperpolarization and all of that stuff. So that's the whole story of action potential finished. So remember that for sodium, for not sodium, I mean ion channels, they can act as a resistor and also conductor. Conductor in the sense that they allow ion channels to come in, but also resistor in the sense that if they're closed, then they will resist the ion channel's conductance, right? And so they're both resistor and conductor. And so yes. Huh? What is this? Wait a minute. Yeah, I don't understand this part. What? What is this? Ah. Wait a minute, 이게 뭐지? 진정이 왔다, 나 그만둬. 라라라라라, 다, 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 나, 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 라라라라다. 빠라, 빠빠라, 빠라, 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 빠빠. Ba-ba-da, ba-da, 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 ba-ba-ba. Ba-da, ba-ba, ba-ba, ba-ba-ba-ba. This time I want you, like this magnetic, you. Nobody got him, yo. I will look away, I will look away, I will look at the mirror, no, da. What am I doing, bruh? I feel like I'm going crazy. You know what? I'm so stressed. What's the point of this? What's the point of all of this? Like the world is so doomed. Like there's so many bad things happening in the world right now, and it's so depressing. Like war and genocide and I don't know, racism, hatred, corruption. Which makes it so depressing to think like what the fuck is going on in this world? It makes it seems like it's all hopeless and like what's the point of doing anything? Because it feels like the world is just so fucked up. But we don't have time to worry about those things. We need to study neuroscience, despite how depressing the world is. So yeah. Fuck. Oh my god, I'm an adult. This is why I'm so depressed, is because I'm an